It's the Dark Reading News Desk. I'm Terry Sweeney. I'm a contributing editor with Dark Reading. I'm joined now by Mark Sangster, Vice President and Industry Security Strategist with eSentire. Mark, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having us.
Let's start by talking about the evolving threat landscape. What sorts of threats are information security professionals bumping up against in 2020?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest issues that we have to address today, which is I think we've thought in very transactional terms about the types of threats that we face, and they're not that anymore. So it is not a simple, low dose or small dose of ransomware. What we're seeing is a significant increase in things like nation-state attacks and also what we would call hands-on keyboard or very long invested types of attacks. So these aren't the quick, transactional, I want to get, $100 or $500 out of you in Bitcoin. I'm looking to steal the crown jewels here, and I'm willing to invest the months and the effort that it's going to take to do that.
So just as crime pays, cybercrime pays, apparently.
Oh, absolutely, right? I mean, I think they're fueling a very well-established ecosystem that, in fact, models a lot of what we do in the Fortune 500 business, right? They're taking that MBA approach to, what tools can I use to optimize my process? How can I expand my market base? How do I thereby, make my tools more successful, my revenue goes up? They think the same way we do. I think the difference is they're applying it more practically. And as they do this, their profits go up, while our expenses, go up, and, unfortunately, so do the losses.
One way, of course, of combating this is managed detection and response. Can you talk a little bit about how that's different from, say, the traditional MSSP providers, and really how MDR is redefining the security industry?
Yeah, I think along with the threat landscape evolving, the challenges with sort of a traditional MSSP models, that came out of, what I'd say is sort of managing devices, right? And really MDR is about managing threats. So as you see these longer kind of form, hands-on keyboard, more elaborate and sophisticated attacks coming from, the well-armed and the well-funded types of threat actors like nation states, it takes a different approach, right? Now it isn't the transactional, can I find, the simple ransomware attack or stop it from spreading too quickly. It now takes threat hunters to go after those adversaries, and that's where managed detection and response really comes in, because that's exactly what it's about, right? It's that's sort of that hand-to-hand type of combat where we're looking for early indicators of concern, that I would call them, and then diving deeper to figure out whether or not they are compromised. And then most importantly here is, when you find that needle in the haystack, it's doing something about it, right? So it's taking the containment or quarantining of a device or whatever it may be and whatever it might take to ensure that these types of attacks don't metastasize and end up being something significant and business disrupting for that organization.
Okay, talk a bit then about how your organization, eSentire, is using its innovations to combat these threats.
It's like, look at the theme of the show, right? It's all about the people and the humans, and security is down to people, process, and technology. And we have a heavily invested infrastructure when it comes to the training in our security operations centers. We have over 100 different security analysts at different levels with different career tracks within the organization, so doing things like, malware analysis and so on. And through the sort of the controls that we put in place, they're leveraging other technologies to bring to the table. So machine learning that we use to filter out 99.9% of all the false positives. It allows us to take the sort of preventative tech to block out what I call the background radiation of the internet, the machine learning to deal with the majority of the alerts that get through that are the nuisances, and that small percentage or fraction of percent that's left, that's where our analysts dig in, and that's where it's within 35 seconds they respond, within 10 minutes it's typically resolved, and and after that it's the reporting it to the client saying this is what happened, and by the way, your lights are still on, and that's good news.
Okay. How are evolving technologies and services adding to the attack surface?
Yeah, so when you think of some of the factors, right, we've obviously touched on the first one, which is of course the threat landscape, and that that's sort of one frame of the triangle. The second major contributor is effectively the self-inflicted risk that we bring, right? So that's the emerging technology. It's it's deploying to the cloud, moving critical and protected data into the cloud, IoT and industrial versions of that. And as we do that, we know less about them. So it's harder for us to profile the risk. And realistically today, I think business is drawn like a siren song, where they know that technology brings them some kind of business gain, be that reduced cost or expanded market or whatever it is. So they're willing to deploy, and in many cases they ignore that risk. And unfortunately, criminals are very good at playing at that. They are reverse engineering cloud technology. They understand that there's confusion around things like who's ultimately responsible. Is it the cloud service provider who provides the security? Is it the client who has to provide it? And the answer is both. And it's understanding those roles and responsibilities, and that's where it gets really muddied, and quite often the ball drops, right, between the players. And that's how criminals are taking advantage of that.
Sure. I mean, speaking of the Internet of Things and the IoT, the endpoint security is obviously a huge focal point, and in parallel, a huge vulnerability. But it's also essential to adopt some form of endpoint security. What do you recommend to customers in that vein?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, endpoint, I think, is a tool now that we use and leverage that provides a whole new layer when it comes to security. So working with Carbon Black and also CrowdStrike Overwatch, for example, it allows us to drill down deeper. So we can forensically determine exactly what's happening on a device, what files have been touched, has registry, as an example, been adjusted, have AV or other security controls been turned off, things like that. And it also gives that second piece, that's the detection element. But on the response side, it also allows us to quarantine those devices. So it's another lens that we can use to sort of zoom in and magnify the problem or the threat and address it. It also allows us to more rapidly do so because, all too often, as we see with a mobile and distributed workforce, they're not inside the mothership, right? They're outside of that firewall. And the old paradigm was kind of like, well, I have to wait until that infected system comes back into the environment and then, starts to spread that pathogen. Well, now we can stop it well before that ever occurs.
Okay. Other options or features that customers should look for in this next generation of managed detection and response services?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you need to stop talking in terms of network, right? I hear this all the time. It's like, well, our network is protected. It's like you need to think of your ecosystem, right? So how are you expanding to have that 360-degree view and understand all the elements, right? That distributed workforce, the emerging technology that we talked about, and being able to address things that typically sort of sit outside the purview of traditional IT, right?
Well, like the cloud.
100%, right? And we're moving what I would call very industry-specific kind of applications and processes into those. Like think healthcare records, it's a real easy one, right? And as we do so, there's a heightened risk. So your MDR vendor has to be capable of seeing that, right? So do they have enough degrees of view in their perspective to be able to pick that up? And then, the second part of that, of course, is, well, if they do they have the right controls to be able to take action when they do find something that's suspicious?
So let's shift gears slightly and talk a little bit about shelfware. What is shelfware exactly for those of us who are not in the know around it? And where do we get the tools and the expertise to combat this threat?
Yeah, I think many companies want to leverage effectively the pre-modeled kind of tools that exist out there, or whatever application it is, be that based on their business. And the challenge with that, of course, is that I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all when it comes to that kind of risk modeling. And as the technology changes, you have to bring in specific expertise that can deal with those things. And that's one of the issues: is do they contextually understand what they're controlling? So they think about very traditional IT kind of processes, controlling access, least privilege, and so on, locking down files, but they don't necessarily understand how those systems are used and deployed on a daily basis. So often the practitioners come to odds with them. And what we've seen through some of the research that we've conducted is that while most companies have, 9 out of 10 companies, for example, or feel that they have adequate skills in-house, or I should say headcount, they're sort of measuring it at the wrong level, right? It's the top level of the budget, or the top number of the budget, and they're missing the point that below that, the vast majority of them, in fact, it's over 80%, don't have the evolving skills in-house. So they're looking for expertise in some of these newer systems. They're also an emerging technology, things like cloud and IoT as an example. But they're also looking for threat hunting and the ability, so not just sort of managing and maintaining those systems, but being able to understand what comes out of them, what does real normal baseline usage look like, and when I see something out of band, how am I going to recognize that that's a challenge? And that is certainly where, where with us, for example, and our adaptive threat fabric, that's the whole point of this, right? Is that idea of there is no, one size fits all off the shelf kind of security solution. It does have to be tailored, and that's what we do. We look at the risk profile of the company, we understand the industries they work in, the data that they manage, and therefore, whatever the responsibilities are around it, how threat actors have gone after them in the past, and the type of technology that they have in-house. So that's the whole point. Like if you're showing up saying, I provide, A, B, and C, and it turns out that you need A, B, and F, that's not going to work, because I can tell you it's that last character is exactly where the bad guys are coming.
Boy, you said it. Great stuff, Mark. This is really, really insightful. I appreciate you spending some time with us today.
Well, thanks very much for giving us the opportunity.
We've been talking with Mark Sangster of eSentire. This has been Terry Sweeney for the Dark Reading News Desk. Thanks for joining us.